Hello, beautiful community. This is going to be a long-ish, but actually really important video, especially for those of you who are, as you're catching this, in a mood for a more thoughtful conversation that takes us to some of the bigger questions about our culture, about the Russo-Ukrainian war, about how we're reacting to it, and about how international relations and politics in general works. So if you are in the mood for that, strap in. I am feeling 5% better than in the last video, which means hopefully this could be less rambly. In the last video, I mean everything I said. So when I'm well enough to make a video, but I'm less physically well, it's not that the content terribly suffers imaginatively and propositionally, but it does suffer as a talk and does suffer as a quality video because it's a bit slower, more laborious. So hopefully it will be not good, but less bad today. Let us begin. And here is what we're going to get out of today. You, for entertainment's purposes, are going to discover a little bit more of what I think about the world. We're going to explore some of the crises we're living through, not just in the world, but in terms of how we're reacting to them. And it's all going to be tied to Russia-Ukraine, predominantly. Not all, but predominantly so. And we'll delve a bit more deeply into how we talk about international affairs, international relations, and politics. I am, because of the health condition that I have, very late starter with my public philosophical contribution. And as that comes out, that's going to develop its critics, which I'm very much looking forward to. And these will be critics that will really be challenging for me. I'm not going to be reacting today to any criticisms that are a problem for me, that keep me awake at night, but I'm picking on them because I think it'll give us quite a lot to go there and explore. And I need to explore what I might be getting wrong in the way I frame some of the issues. I might discover that in the process of speaking with you. So don't be freaked out by the absurdity of a couple of the criticisms I might pick. They are going to bring us value. I promise it'll bring us a lot of value to engage with them. So the first criticism that has been a little bit about, but has come out more recently, and I will not be naming or pinging any individuals here. And this is all just sort of reactions to my content. We're not talking about essays or videos people have made in response to me. The first criticism is that I support negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, and that obviously that's wrong. Wrong with a capital W and wrong with a small w. Now, of course, I don't support negotiations because my channels and even my content off YouTube, the little I've done on radio, tiny bit on TV, has been has been God. Has been all about explaining why negotiations are bad and anyway unsustainable. But I promise you that it's not a waste of your time to engage with that objection. And what I'll do is do two things. First of all, I'll share a little of how I think, but much more interestingly, how patterns of thought for other people and for experts are developing on this issue. I'll share a bit of that with you. And then I'll give you a little bit of the sociology of the criticism that I'm a supporter of negotiations. every criticism I mentioned has come over time from a sufficient number of people such that I'm motivated to bring it up. Well, let me just say in a very brief way what I think is wrong with the criticism. And I hope you don't mind me doing that. I hope I don't need to establish with you why the criticism is wrong, because you just know that if you watch my content. But what the criticism is really about is a kind of selective misquoting. We're already beginning to touch on why it's going to be so interesting to talk about this. It's a bit like if you said many people are putting bananas in their carrot cake, and I said, look at her, look at him, she thinks that it's good to put bananas in carrot cakes. And we'll get in a moment to what is so fascinating sociologically about this, because this is an extremely common pattern of discourse in our culture. It's developed, I would say, since about 2015. So it's quite a recent pattern. And it carries a lot of very destructive trends that threaten just about everything, because as you know, if we screw up with our democracies, we screw up with our foreign policy at the same time. So, before I get to the sociology of this very fascinating and therefore important criticism, I want to say something about my view, but only something very brief, because I want to say something about other people's views that is more interesting. The war is still on course to be decided on the battlefield. And only a perception of an unimprovable situation on the battlefield would motivate a side to negotiate. Which is to say that what Ukraine needs is to push Putin back as far as possible, and then we need to see what happens. Negotiating now is entirely unsustainable if we take into account the agency of Putin, because he either wants the process of negotiations without real negotiations happening in it, or he doesn't want negotiations. He partly doesn't want negotiations because the conflict is going sufficiently favorably to him, he thinks, or insufficiently unfavorably. And he partly wants negotiations as a war tactic, as a tactic of gaining an advantage. And so Zelensky's analysis, just from the other day in the Baltics, that some kind of deal and a pause in the war is an opportunity for Putin to gain an advantage in the war, which he will be convinced of as being a war that is to be continued. The objection to my position here is that I'm overestimating the extent to which, the objection from the people who may be more open to negotiations, is that I'm overestimating the extent to which war and regime security go together for Putin. And obviously, I think I'm not overestimating that. In other words, I think there is something unsustainable about peace for Putin from a regime security point of view, which is to say, it's not that Putin wants to carry on the war, it's that he just must. And therefore, obviously, the ideal scenario for Ukraine is to negotiate from a position of significant military advantage. For example, if they were on the verge of taking Crimea, that could be a place to negotiate. The trouble, of course, is that Ukraine is militarily very, very far from a scenario like that. But that does not make negotiations sustainable. So this is not my best shot at this, but this lazy answer is enough, because all of you have heard me say this infinitely more articulately than I just now have an infinite number of times over 2 years. Now, here's the interesting part. This is what others think. Western experts, let's just pick the ones who are in our camp, which is actually the overwhelming majority, who want more support for Ukraine, who recommend more support for Ukraine, which is my recommendation too, even though I don't make recommendations. But more support for Ukraine, liking experts, break down into two camps. And in fact, that's a lie, because they don't even think of there as being two camps, but there should be. The first camp is where basically nearly everybody fits. And that's a camp that thinks that the problem with the West is that it's not supporting Ukraine enough out of weakness. There's a second camp, which I'm increasingly in recent commentary articulating, inviting experts to step into. And that camp says it's not weakness, it's democratic incapacity. If you think it's weakness, then you're going to think that the central problems are lack of willpower. If you're going to think that it's democratic incapacity, in other words, our systems are too much in crisis for us to deliver certain results. And the way I make that argument is that our systems are too much in crisis to deliver a strategy, and only a strategy could deliver results. Democratic incapacity, lack of strategy, limited results. That's the box I'm recommending for experts to climb into, instead of giving a very understandable kind of visceral experience, which says, oh, come on, don't you see, we can still do this, but don't you see, but come on. And that's a little bit like encouraging a cat to fly. If you understand the problem properly, you might explore and discover new ways to make the cat get there without necessarily flying, get a little bit further down toward where you want it to go without flying. Because if it's a democratic incapacity, it ain't gonna fly. And so the experience here of experts is often, well, the politicians, they're saying some of the right things, they're thinking some of the right things, but that's just not translating into any results that are compelling enough to get us some of the outcomes, some of the security outcomes we want, which is like strategy and more action. So that distinction is very important, and I'm very happy to make it because I think it's genuinely useful. Weakness versus democratic incapacity. There was a lovely, I actually was about to print it out, there was a lovely comment. I don't share it as a matter of fact, there was a lovely comment from a Ukrainian underneath our last discussion together. And that comment basically said, you're all good with your principles, you Westerners, but when it comes to sticking with your supposed allies who supposedly share your principles, when the going gets tough, you buckle. And so in a certain sense, Putin's analysis that you're weak is right. And interestingly, that's a discouraging analysis that a lot of Russians would share too, but they would just see it as encouraging. Now, that is, and we'll come back to it later on in our discussion, a kind of bizarrely liberally idealist view of this. I mean, the idea that we're helping Ukraine because that aligns with our principles is not a central explanation of anything we're doing or not doing. There's a plethora of considerations that are far more important than that. One is European security. One is stopping the Russians. Another is stopping the Russians from going further. Another is depleting Russian capacity. On and on and on and on. And we'll talk about the general principles that sort of are behind why I'm saying what I'm saying now. But nevertheless, that's a very interesting perspective that I think is enormously widely shared in Ukraine and enormously widely shared in Russia, only they take it there as a sign of Western weakness and an encouragement. And again, this account is a sort of liberal idealist. We'll come in a moment to what that term might mean. But it's a sort of liberal idealist version of the story, that it's lack of will that's causing the problem. And I disagree with that. I think obviously you can do more with more willpower, but I can tell you this. I am completely confident that Joe Biden would like to help Ukraine more than he's doing. Now let's give a little bit of the sociology of the Vlad says Ukraine needs to negotiate now view. Of my view. Which is false, because the carrot cake example is false, right? If you say many people put bananas in, and I quote you as saying, let's put bananas in there, that's a deliberate misrepresentation. This is very, very common. And we're going to look at some of the patterns involved here. Is it weird, historically? Yeah. Now, I professionally have a foot in intellectual history. I do not have a foot in the social reception of ideas, really, insofar as that is a field, and I think that is a field. But nevertheless, I'm confident that that is new. The scale on which people are saying, she is saying to put bananas in the carrot cake is quite new. It's something that wasn't the case in 1999 in our world. It's a recent pattern, right? And it's an expression of something I won't be elaborating on this occasion, which is hyper-identity politics. One of the defining features of hyper-identity politics is depoliticization, and that I'll talk about. There is a global crisis of depoliticization, and you've heard me rave on about that before. And here is what's very, very interesting. And because of this extraordinary literal-mindedness that is so prevalent in our world, this extraordinary attachment to surfaces, right? It's that surface of, I have heard something positive about bananas in carrot cake, so off I go now. I can now say, this person advocates for bananas. Well, no, you didn't hear that. You heard a statement about what, in that person's opinion, many people are doing. You heard nothing about what that person recommends. As far as you're concerned, they could think that's the worst thing to do on earth, to put bananas in carrot cakes. So we're talking about a way of reacting that is signals-based, not meaning-based. You're not looking at what the person there thinks or feels or means. You're looking at certain surface signals, and if they appear, and it's irrelevant in what context they appear, off you go. You can then drum the drum of, if you like, the theatrics, the drunk theatrics of advocacy. Now, an example of that might be students on campus advocating for a foreign word in a foreign language course to be banned because in English it is very close to an offensive word, right? That is conceivable on a modern campus in 2024. It is inconceivable in 2004 on any Western campus. Now, let me make an interesting translation of the depoliticization aspect of this into the Ukraine-Russia story. But because we're in this literal-minded world, let me make something very clear. It is bad to support Putin. It is good to support Ukraine. Having established this, and I'll say this again at the end of the next sentence, let me say this. the depoliticized Russian who outsources her politics to Putin so that he can go on and create destruction in Ukraine, and also runs to IKEA immediately when the war starts, is in some non-trivial sociological respect an expression of the same social phenomenon as the Western pro-Ukraine activist who watches some content, reads some content which says many people in the West are talking about negotiation, and translates that as this content says that we should negotiate. We should ask Ukraine to negotiate. So that's to say, a pro-Ukraine activist who thinks that Putin has expired 7 times in the last month, and who thinks that the Putin regime is about to collapse, and who thinks that the West is fully behind the Ukrainian victory. Right? It's depoliticization, and the reason it's part of the same social phenomena as the Russian who outsources politics to Putin is that some of the social causes of both are the same. They are some of the causes we've discussed in recent videos about the untethering of our society, about the pulling apart of certain bonds that allow us to talk together properly, engage with each other with a sense of the public good and solidarity, and allow us also to engage in conflict constructively. Because it's obviously not a constructive way to engage in conflict if I think that bananas shouldn't be put in carrot cake, and I want there to be no bananas in carrot cakes, but as soon as I hear somebody say, many people say we should put bananas in carrot cakes, if I misinterpret that as them saying that bananas should be put in carrot cake, I'm completely diluting the actual agency in the world into a kind of a swish of magical thinking whereby only certain little signals matter to me, but the real world doesn't. Now, there are a couple of more minor trends here. And one is that our reading comprehension and our listening comprehension is down. And so we get these signal type ways of engaging. Another trend here is consumerism, right? That if I'm reading your articles in this culture, I'm a bit inclined that I've bought you on Amazon, and so therefore you should deliver me whatever you're delivering me. Maybe you're delivering me ground pepper. Maybe you are delivering for me the dehumidification of my room, my bathroom. Maybe you are delivering me protection from the sun because you're a sunscreen, but I paid $8.99 for you. You are a sunscreen, and if I'm getting burned by the sun, I don't like it because that's what I bought you for. So we have a kind of, I've bought this thing to do X, Y, Z for me, it's not doing X, Y, Z for me, relationship to content we consume, which is of course very dangerous, because the kind of content you've got to consume to grow is precisely a content that you need to consume in a non-consumerist way. It's really important to say that it's okay to consume content in a consumerist way, because we don't want to say that higher instincts should have priority over lower instincts. That would be a terrible world. If that always happened, it would be a world really that would have to be a world without human beings. Human beings would have to be other than what they are. It's a terrible misanthropic nightmare where people, never choose to play with Barbies instead of reading Shakespeare, right? But we can't just play with Barbies. We've got to read some Shakespeare, some equivalent of reading Shakespeare is important. And a consumerist relationship with content is very much a threat. And of course, algorithms encourage that, because what they encourage isn't what you're going to love the most. They encourage what is your first instinct to like. And the result of this is bad citizens. And here, my nightmare scenario is that these depoliticized citizens, who paradoxically might be very politically engaged, because this is a funny contrast. I gave you an example of one citizen who's just going like that, like war, what war? They know what war, but they're saying war. And they know, but they're sort of half forcing that knowledge to retreat into the subconscious. And another example of a highly politically engaged person, but I've called them both depoliticized, because sort of unconstructive political activity, constitutively unconstructive political activity, is often a product of deep depoliticization. Criticism number 2 that has been interesting, and that's that my position has, and this does have a consumerist ring, that my position has become more defeatist recently about Ukraine's prospect of Ukraine's victory. And at this point, I want to say something really important. I want some of you who need to kind of ignore everything I'm saying in this video if it's going to have the effect of you being more cautious to contradict me in the comments. It's a very serious warning I'm giving you. I will be extremely upset and I will cry all day and all night if you feel uncomfortable about saying things that contradict what I'm saying in the comments. For the obvious reason that fundamentally I'm not here to offer you views for purchase. I'm offering you concerns, pictures, bits of the imagination, distinctions, and also sometimes some hand-holding and gentleness, and some illumination. On a good day, that happens at least. But again, it's a kind of misanthropic nightmare if I'm sitting here expecting you to develop views that are close to my own. Moreover, I don't have propriety over what you do with what I give. And that's part of this love business when you engage in public intellectual work. You've got to let go. You don't control what people do with what you're giving them. You don't get to control that. You don't get to say, here's an ice cream, and by the way, eat it at that pace and sit on that bench, then follow it with this other ice cream. No. So it's very important. And I know that sometimes, so I have this policy, and I sometimes do something that could encourage that in you, and I want to be very transparent about that. So I have a policy, I'm not sure how accurately I stick to it, to stay in certain brackets that don't dramatically transcend the customer service, if you can call it customer service, in your local bakery. Which is to say that if you come in and you say that I've put something into the bread that I actually haven't put, for example, I'm not going to call you out on it in an emphatic way and in a very stern way. But I only do that 90% of the time. 10% of the time I do, actually, because I think it's kind of more organic and human. I do to vary it, to give this 9-10, 90-10 ratio. I do vary it up, and I actually do respond to you as though we were having a conversation. But what is difficult about that is that if I'm responding very sternly to you in person, I'll be able to hold you, right? If that begins to impact you in a harsh way, I'll be able to see that straight away, and I'll compensate, and I'll hold you up, and I won't let you fall over just because I've said something abrupt your way. And so I'll make you feel okay about that. I can't do that in a silly text on the internet. So there's always runs risk. And then when I do that and I say, well, that is an obvious silly thing to say in 3 ways, and this is it. So I'd advise you not to say that. If I write a comment like that, I know the danger of it, and that's why maybe I should reflect on that 90-10 balance. And the danger is that somebody who's a member of the beautiful community, who is sitting, let us say, I don't know, in Vermont, and he or she is, let us say, 65 years old and with love and gentleness watching this, and sees a couple of comments like that from me, might say, well, I might be subconsciously a bit conservative about feeling free to just say stuff under videos in case Vlad comes in and he puts me in some corner. So it's an interesting balance, and I'm very, very aware of that. And I mean, the only thing I can do in this very conversation is just tell you, I will cry so much if you stop contradicting me in the comments. It's an essential part of the community. Has my position changed towards something more pessimistic? Roughly, no. I mean, I remember putting very, very early on low odds on Ukraine taking Crimea, in the sense that from the beginning I pissed some of you off by saying, well, as things stand, we're not in a situation where that looks remotely likely. And that's to say that the situation could have arisen, which it was likely, but we were never in a situation from where it looked like it would be likely. Might get to that situation. Doesn't look like it at all now, but you never know in war. But we've never been in it. And I think that I've certainly improved a lot in many of the analyses I offer, and there's so much to improve still, but I haven't radically reconsidered my rough analysis of for instance, of the phases of the Putin regime from 1999 till today. What was each block about? Roughly have the same views about that. And I roughly have the same views about Western responses. It's been since the war and Western response in 2014. I mean, don't forget, I'm not coming new to this subject, even though my views are quite different depending on which phase of the Putin regime, for instance, we're talking about. I recall a conversation, I think a long conversation I had with Sir Adam Roberts, who interestingly wrote an interesting brief but interesting objection to Mearsheimer, The Economist, not long ago. He's emeritus professor of international relations at Oxford, and we were in the politics department, I think, washing dishes, and we were trying to make analogies between Putin's first term and some 19th century Russian Tsar. And so I was trying to place the nature of the centralizing authoritarian project of Putinism, at the beginning and give it different shapes as it evolved. I still don't believe that's my expertise. I'm a political philosopher with some insight some insight culturally, some insight historically, some insight on the ground, and that combination is important, but it's the political philosopher's story that leads there. So I don't recognize significant changes. And I have a responsibility when I smell something in the air to begin talking about it. And quite a few months ago, more than a few months ago, I was beginning to talk about talk in Western centers of power about, well, what can we give Ukraine to shut it up and agree to something? Maybe it can be something to do with the reconstruction. What can we give for Ukraine's reconstruction to make it shut up and do a deal? Right? That conversation has been absolutely active in Western centers of power for a very, very long time, and it is extravagantly naive to deny it. And so when that's to be smelt in the air, it's my responsibility to tell you this. Algorithmically, the way that works, of course, is that we're a community made up of different circles, and the outermost circle, and these are people who would probably fit into that widest, 250,000 returning audience on the main channel. Well, we'll see if it's still there after 2 months of absence, when I share the Russia breakup video soon, which I'm working on health allowing. But what that audience most of all wants is a daily video that says that Russia is on fire, right? It's on fire Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So, of course, there's going to be a big algorithmic hit if I talk about many of the issues I talk about, but it's just my responsibility to do so. I cannot deprioritize that, obviously, because it's true, and because it directly affects your mental health, to be told the truth, and it directly affects your capacity to make sense of the world and form your own views. Because I'm not here to inform you, you are already informed, basically. I'm here to inflect certain ways of seeing, maybe help you rearrange them, help you broaden them, or extend them in some direction. And so if something is in the air, I need to begin talking about it, even before I can myself fully formulate every aspect of it. That's part of the point of the chat channel. And so, of course, recently what I was raising is this temptation to explore a way out, even though, as I say, my position is there isn't a sustainable way out, right? And what you really need is a strategy, the back of which you can support Ukraine more. But to get that, you need democratic capacity, which we don't have. So, criticism 3. This is a good one. Vlad is Russian, which makes him blindly anti-Russian, as he adopts some liberal idealist position. Or Vlad is Russian, and it makes him the opposite, a bit soft on Russia, soft on Russian imperialism. That's a recurrent story. By the way, what we're talking about are very, very, very small scale reactions. Just to give you an illustration of it. The last video on the chat channel was disliked by more people. I don't mean literally disliked, but sort of viscerally disliked. And in the literal sense, at the level of pressing the button like versus dislike, it had a like ratio of 98%. 2% dislikes, which is very unusual for the chat channel because the like ratio is normally over 99%. So these are the small differences we're talking about. We're not talking about anything more, but I believe there is value here. So let's do this one. Um, and let's do the I am too tough on Russia second, and I'm too soft on Russia we can do first. Now, some of the things I've been talking about recently are to do with change, concerns, issues, transformation in Ukraine. All of these conversations have been at a considerable distance, deliberately at a considerable distance. They've been terribly gentle. They're things that if I were a Ukrainian citizen, I would, well, if I wasn't at the front, I'd be, well, I wouldn't be at the front with my health condition, but these things would be concerning me very much on a totally different level if I were a Ukrainian citizen, but I'm not. So some of this is Ukraine's conversation about its own history and about its own future, and a conversation that engages with what is unconstructive to with what is constructive decolonization, with political issues from efficacy to corruption. And it would be this extraordinary civic reset that is a central theme that I've discussed briefly already in Ukrainian politics in 2024, where in a certain sense, cartoonishly speaking, they're looking at a government that was there to do one job, now it's going to do a different job. From a short, potentially victorious war to a long-term, stuck war. New questions arise about the government's arrangements with the citizenry. And I won't say more about that now, but it'll be a year of politicization in Ukraine. And I say something that I want to share with you. I think this is a tweet. With Russia, there's a risk of the aestheticization of evil, looking at something spectatorally and forgetting that we need to react. But with Ukraine, there is a risk of Disneyfication, right, which stops serious thought about Ukraine's problems, challenges, needs. And of course, we do harm to Ukraine by not supporting it sufficiently, but we also do a grave harm to Ukraine by Disneyfying it. And let me ask you a very interesting question here. Because what is absolutely striking is how little people know about Ukraine and how little pro-Ukrainian Westerners know about Ukraine. How little they know about Ukraine's politics. It's extraordinary. I don't think it's a fault. And in many ways, it is the Disneyfication that is motivating a lot of people. But let's say I took the beautiful community and I put the community into an examination room. Please forgive me for doing this for 30 minutes. And I gave you a task. Just write whatever you know, whatever comes to mind about Mr. Yermak. Like, who is he? What does he do? Why is he so central in Ukrainian politics? And then I said, well, you know what? Write the same about some Russian figure. Mr. Patrushev, Mr. Girkin, Mr. Prigozhin. I would overwhelmingly bet that major characters in Russian politics would get more words and more accurate words written about them than in Ukraine. There's also a very interesting factor. I'm not saying we know that much about Russia. We're projecting a lot to we as a community. But I actually would fancy that we probably know a bit more about Russia. And that's interesting. That's an important observation. But that reality, that lack of friction, further enhances this risk of Disneyfication, which is dangerous, obviously, to impose on a country is facing enormous challenges, that need big answers. Let me say something a bit comical. I have very rarely heard the point of Vlad's Russian. Largely, most people don't see me quite in that light. They see me as more of a Westerner. And certainly psychologically, anybody who meets me can recognize that. But very small number of people are sometimes keen to say, when they don't like something I've said, oh, that's because these Russians. And there is an irony here. And that is, and this is something I'll mention briefly in the next main channel video. Well, I left when I was 9. So I have a deep understanding of the culture and the language. And I'm of it a bit, but I'm mostly not. Just culturally, if you're German, we're gonna connect instinctively much more directly than if you're Russian or Ukrainian for that matter. So I'm psychologically predominantly a Westerner. And insofar as these points come from folks who are in some of the ex-Soviet states, for example, psychologically, they are much closer to Russians than I am because the cultural distance is just so big. Obviously, somebody even from Western Ukraine is probably, if you picked a random person, going to be more psychologically close to somebody from Petersburg than somebody from Berlin, in my view. There'll be a big cultural difference between Russia and Ukraine, and there's an entire profound difference of political mythologies, actually. Political culture is very, very different. And Russia's, Ukraine is not Russia. Right? But there. So that's the irony. And of course, that kind of, and I don't like this word because it's mostly used excessively and loosely, but that kind of essentialization, while it actually isn't, instinctively still to me feels terribly anti-European. It really isn't anti-European because we lean authoritarian right in our politics in Europe overall, categorize all of Europe. But there we go. So you could certainly find a lot of people less Russian than me, but I'm preponderantly not Russian. And psychologically, that is completely obvious about me. And indeed, everything I do is aimed at Westerners, and that is the conversation we're having. 1% of our audience is Ukrainian. 0.5% of our audience is Russian. Let's look at the point that I'm too soft on Russia. And that out of a certain kind of self-loathing, I have generated this itself Disneyfied liberal idealist picture. Well, that's almost as absurd as the first criticism, because of course, whatever you might take the tenets of liberal idealism to be, I might reject most of them. But here is the answer I'm going to give. I am not a liberal idealist of a kind of pathological kind, because I essentially reject international relations theory if, and only if, I don't reject international relations, its theory is, if you like, theoretical and theoretically simplistic enough. Which is to say that any proper theorization of international relations is, I think, a constitutive mistake. And that would cover every position in international relations. John Mearsheimer and his opponents. And that is because the theorization of international relations doesn't demand of one that one reduce the motivations that motivate states. One can still postulate a plurality of motivations that motivate states. This is going to be a little bit philosophical for a few minutes, but we'll come out the other side soon enough. The motivations that apply to states are possibly plural as far as international relations theory goes, with proper theory. But they have to be ranked. There has to be a priority between the plurality of motivations that drive states. And that priority needs to be stated at a general theoretical level. Otherwise, you don't have international relations theory. And that is impossible. Because what motivates a state out of all of these possible plural values and motives is going to be too deeply dependent on the political culture involved, right? And hence, any abstract international relations explanation of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine ain't gonna work, because you need to understand Russia's political culture to understand what the war even means and why it's happening. Insofar as there is a real position in international relations, that is a non-theoretical position I take, it is realism. But it's certainly not the realism that you associate with international relations theory. It's realism that is contrasted with moralism. And the spirit here is that basic considerations about what makes politics tick come first, not moral principles. There is a kind of applied morality nature to certain ways of thinking about politics. And it's that I do reject. But here we're not contrasting different international relations theories as such. But it's certainly possible to say we're comparing contrasting approaches. And so what moralism does that I reject, and it has a very rich historical tradition, which I oppose, right? And my tradition can be traced complexly, perhaps, via originally maybe Thucydides and then Machiavelli. But moralism is a position that puts right at the center the importance and the causal efficacy of expressing moral judgments. That expressing moral judgment is a very central political activity. And that is what I reject. Two neighboring thoughts here are, of course, that it's very wrong to conceive of politics on the model of an argument. Politics is a negotiation of shared space, if you're inside a country, or indeed a shared world, if you are a country. But it's not an intellectual argument. Another very important consideration is that reason doesn't have its own social power. the social power of a reason does not become greater just because the reason is a good one. If you are sitting in Belarus and you have a very good reason to say something about Mr. Lukashenko, the fact that what you're saying is true isn't going to give you any social power if what you'd said is false. In fact, it might be precisely because what you've said is true that you're going to be taken away. And one of the sort of what my colleague Raymond Goyce calls illusions of self-realization in these waters is just the idea that if a lot of people think that something is good and a lot of people begin working toward it, that it therefore becomes doable. Whereas in fact, it's an enormously contingent and complex question, whether something is doable or not, no matter how many people want it, and no matter how many people want it and are aspiring to attain it. It's a kind of a tendency for us to give moral proclamation causal priority in the world that it just can't have, realistically. I'm going to be very naughty and just take 30 seconds to give 3 philosophical points here that are only going to be interesting to 1% of you. There is no clear separation between moral and non-moral reasons in politics, reasons for action. There is no clear way to ascertain a priority between moral and non-moral reasons for action. And there is no clear way to even begin to make progress on making these 2 points less true than they are, even if one wanted to go out there and begin making this progress. Bismarck. A quote. I too accept as my own principle the idea that one must struggle against the revolution. But I do not think it possible to apply this principle in politics in such a way as to allow something which is only a potential further consequence one might draw from this principle through an arbitrarily large number of further steps, to override every other consideration. One should not, that is, allow this principle to constitute the only trump in the game, so that the weakest card of this suit simply trumps even the highest card of every other. And what I think we take away from that is that for politics to be ethically adequate, because we don't want morality removed from politics, because that's crazy, and causally crazy, right? I mean, you get morally outraged by Putin's bombardment of Ukraine, you get active and you support Ukraine. There's a moral causation at work there. But moral considerations are, first of all, unclear as to whether they begin and end and whether other kinds of considerations take over. But moral considerations, insofar as they can be differentiated, are one consideration among others in politics, nothing more. One consideration among others. And the thing we want is to avoid a situation where moral considerations just completely slip out of your politics. But we also don't want a situation where moral considerations are excessively dominant over other considerations in your politics, right? So what you want is to not lose moral considerations out of sight, but also for them not to be overweening as you try to deal with whatever is your own culture's version of reckoning with the basic questions politics always presents us with: questions of power, questions of order, questions of avoiding certain types of anarchy, and so on. And the questions of making things better than they are once you've established some stability around these basic needs and concerns. obviously it's extraordinary if you've survived this long meandering talk. I'm very grateful that you have been with me, and we've been slow this year, but I'm very committed to a lot of exciting stuff happening on the main channel. We're just slow because of health, but my plans are exciting for what's to come soon. Lots of love and catch you.